All right. As you might imagine, my work at Twins Smoke Shop, which is kind of my day job when I'm not here, brings me into contact with a lot of people. And when those people find out that I am actually a pastor too, a lot of times they blink. And a lot of conversations start that way. And there's a lot of people who have a lot of questions about Christianity and what it is. I get asked all the time, is that real? Do you really believe that? Does God even exist? How do you know? How do you know it's true? Why did Jesus have to die? What would you say if I told you that even people who were disciples of Jesus had very similar questions? Luke 24:13 relates the story of two disciples who were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus shortly after the death of Jesus. They're joined by a traveler who sees that they're sad. And surprised that this guy seems to be clueless as to the events that have gone on over the last few days, they tell him that they had been followers of Jesus, who they thought was the Messiah, but he'd been handed over to the chief priests, who sentenced him to death and was actually crucified. And then, to make things even more confusing, some of their number, a few of the ladies, had gone to the tomb on Sunday morning, but he wasn't there. And then they sent some of the guys to ascertain whether these women were telling the truth or not, and they couldn't find him either. Then the traveler spoke to them, saying, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Didn't the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Genesis 15, which we are looking at today, was likely among those passages that Jesus shared with those two disciples on the road. And Abram's story, this is a picture of Abram here, makes it clear why a Messiah was needed, why that Messiah had to be God, and why he needed to suffer and die. Abram hears from God to leave with his family when he's 75 years old, just after his father had died. He and his wife Sarai had been married and childless for a long time already. How many of you are already past 75? We got a couple, okay? That's when God started with this guy. For all you other young people out there, just wait. God might still call you yet. All right? Now, this may come as a shock, but Abram was not really a good, godly boy waiting to hear from God when we first meet him in Genesis chapter 12. To the contrary, according to Joshua 24, verse 2, Abram and his family were living in a pagan culture and worshiping idols. The god du jour at that time was a god called Nana. That may be what you call your grandma, but Nana at that time was a god. Abram was not the honest Abe, oddball out, who didn't bow down to the gods of Mesopotamia and distance himself from seeking favor through sacrifice and temple prostitution. He, Sarai, his whole family were all regulars at Nana's temple when God spoke to him in Genesis 12. And it's to this pagan 75-year-old guy that God says, "Go from your country your people, and your father's household and land, to a land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and I will make you a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. In that light, God's promise seems prodigal in the true sense of the word. Prodigal doesn't mean lost. It means recklessly extravagant. Like the lost son in Jesus' parable in Luke 15, who rejected his father but gladly took his money and spent it on food and booze and women until it was all gone, Abraham was also far from God and was lost in an idolatrous lifestyle. But unlike the younger son in Jesus' parable, Abram never seems to have realized or come to the conclusion that he was, in essence, living among the pigs. But, just like the father in Jesus' parable, God was out on the road looking for Abram. And when he found him, he blessed him, made himself his God, and promised what Nana had never been able to provide: children, provision, land, and honor. How did Abram respond? Well, he starts off well. He gets up, he takes his family, and he leaves. He heads out. But the stories of Genesis 13 and 14 tell us that Abram didn't become a paragon of piety overnight. While he's in Egypt, he lies about Sarah to Pharaoh, telling her that she was his sister and not his wife, which put her in a situation where she would likely have ended up becoming a wife to Pharaoh. The whole thing is avoided only because God intervened, and Abram and Sarah end up being unceremoniously sent away. The next thing we see is Abram and Lot getting into a family fight over feeding the flocks. Things go so bad that Abram floats the idea, why don't we part ways? You choose. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. He couldn't even keep his family together. The result of that is that Lot and his family end up being taken as prisoners of war. And when Abram hears about it, he takes some of his men and, with God's blessing, took the captors completely by surprise and saves Lot and his family. Again, God is doing with Abram and going with him and protecting him and his family, even though he wasn't able to keep his family from splitting up. That brings us to Genesis 15, which is our text for this morning. Let's read through this passage together. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield. You are a very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how do I know I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To you and your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Let's walk through this chapter together. Abram had just enjoyed a major victory, but now he was anxious that these 4 kings that he had rescued his nephew Lot from were going to take their revenge on him and his family. God encourages him and tells him not to fear them. He would protect him. He would be his provider. Now, you can see Abram's anxiety and angst come quickly to the surface. How can I believe that? I'm an old man with an old wife, and I have no children. How do I know you're telling me the truth? You promised me children, but I have none. You promised me land, but I have no means to possess it. Without children, you can't give me what you promised. The closest thing I have to an heir is my servant. How does God respond to his doubt and fear? He doesn't rebuke him or condemn him or correct him. He makes him a promise. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And he took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. And then we have that pivotal verse upon which the doctrine of justification by faith alone is based. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Verse 6. Abraham accepted God's promise and put his faith in it. Sorta. I say sort of because the very next verse where God reaffirms his promise to Abram and his descendants and all the land that he was living in, and that all of that was going to happen, Abram's faith gives way to his doubts again. But sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'm going to possess it? Then God tells Abram to bring him a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Once Abram gets them, he kills them, cuts them in half, and sets up the halves opposite of each other. How did Abram know how to do that? How did he know what God was asking for? Because this is how promises were made binding and legal in that culture. God was making a covenant promise, what Abraham would have understood as a legally binding agreement. The Hebrew word for covenant actually comes from the word for cut. You cut a covenant with somebody. The way it normally worked was that the animals, like the ones that Abram were asked to get, were cut in two, and then the person making the covenant would walk between the two pieces while legal witnesses watched, saying what he or she would do and the promises that they were making. And the implication was, if they don't keep that promise, may they end up like these animals. It's like saying, cross my heart and hope to die, with a little bit more oomph. If two people were making a covenant together, each of them would walk through the pieces. When a king made a covenant with his people, the subjects would walk between the pieces. Now, notice here that God doesn't tell Abram to get the animals for Abram. He tells them to get them for himself. Bring me these animals. They were for God to make the promise, not for Abram to make the promise. Second, God put Abram to sleep as he passed through the pieces. Abram was kept from walking through them himself. Only God did. This promise did not depend on Abram. It was not a two-way covenant where promises were made with basically meaning, as long as you do this, I'll do that. I'll do this, but you better do that. That wasn't how this worked. It was one way. Abram asked God for a sign, and God gave him one. He gave him one that he understood. He gave him one that put all the risk and responsibility on God and put none of it on him. God promised to do everything that he had promised Abram to do. Abram's being faithful and obedient had nothing to do with it. It was all grace. You see that? God let Abram witness himself entering into a covenant with Abram on his behalf. The covenant was with Abraham in the sense that it was for Abram, but it didn't depend on Abram. His part in the covenant wasn't to take the oath, but to be the legal witness of God's oath to Abram to give him and his descendants the promised land. Abram's part was to believe that God would keep his promise and that God accepted that faith and counted it as righteousness. Abram's story makes it very clear why a Messiah was needed, why that Messiah had to be God, and why he needed to suffer and die. Abram's story makes it clear why a Messiah was needed. Abram was a broken, messed up, anxious guy. The very next thing we read about Abram, the very next thing we read about him, after God makes this incredible promise, complete with divine theophany of God's visible presence, is him agreeing with his wife Sarai that it was impossible for her to have children, so he should sleep with her maidservant. My friends, Islam traces its roots back to Abram through the son of that relationship, Ishmael. We are still living in the after effects of that sin. If Abram was ever going to be the father of the faithful, it was going to be by grace. We are no less prone to such things. Our faith wavers like his. We're prone to fall like him. We're prone to fail like him. If God didn't decide to step in and graciously say, I will take your faith and count it as righteousness, we would be done. Abram's story makes it crystal clear we need a Savior. Does that make sense? Are you tracking with this? Second, Abram's story makes it clear why that Messiah had to be God. When God passed through the pieces of those animals, he was showing Abram what he was going to do. What we see in Genesis 15 is the second person of the Trinity foreshadowing what he was going to do on our behalf. The Hebrew word that the NIV translates as descendants in verse 18 is actually the word seed, and it is singular, not plural. In Romans 5 and Galatians chapter 3, Paul makes the argument that what was promised had two meanings. First, that God was promising Abram and his descendants the land, and second, that it was ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Being Abraham's descendants and bringing them into the promised land, that land of the Kenites and Kazites and all the other ites that we read about in those verses, was a historical sign of what Jesus was going to be doing spiritually with Abraham and his descendants. Jesus was the seed through which all Abram's spiritual descendants would be given the real promised land of heaven. Third, Abram's story makes it clear why Jesus needed to suffer and die. God cut Abram out of the transaction so that Jesus could cut him and his descendants in on its benefits. What God promised Abraham in that covenant, he did through Jesus' death on the cross. Neither Abram nor any other person before or after him could make that walk and live. So if Jesus was really going to live as one of us and take our place, he had to die too. Both the covenant and the cross teach us that the penalty for sin is death. Physical death is necessary for sins to be forgiven, for without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins, says Hebrews 9:22. Both the covenant and the cross teach us that Jesus was going to take our place in making and giving that sacrifice. Jesus' death was substitutionary, meaning that he took our punishment on himself. And that wasn't just physical death. It was experiencing the judgment of God for all the sin committed against him. That's what made Jesus cry out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When we say in the Apostles' Creed, he descended into hell, that's what's being referred to. Jesus was forsaken by God on the cross, meaning the love and honor and joy that he had always experienced with the Father was replaced with wrath and curses and judgment. If Abram had been made to walk through those pieces, if God's covenant had depended on his faithfulness and obedience, or on that of his descendants, he and all who would have tried would have failed, been judged, and condemned to die. Instead, Jesus took our place. Jesus lived the life that we should have lived and took the judgment we should have been given when he was on the cross. He made that walk through the valley of the shadow of death for us. The good news of the gospel is that because Jesus made that walk, you never need to. Because Jesus entered that truly God-forsaken place, Christians never have to go in. If there's one sure description of Christians, it's that they are a people who are never forsaken by God. You can have complete assurance and peace, knowing that God will never leave you or forsake you, because Jesus made a walk that will never be necessary for any Christian to take again. That promise of Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That's your prayer. That's my prayer. That's our promise. Because Jesus walked through that very valley and was forsaken. God's promise to Abram's descendants in Isaiah 54, verse 4, do not be afraid, you will not be put to shame. Do not fear disgrace, you will not be humiliated, is yours. Because Jesus was put to shame. The great promise, I will forgive their wickedness and never again remember all their sins, of Jeremiah 31:34 and Hebrews 8:12 is yours. It's yours. Because Jesus walked into the valley of your sin and suffered God's justice, so you would never need to.
Amen.
Amen.